Welcome back, guys. I'm Mike Burrows from StanceWorks. We're here working on this Ferrari K-swap project, and we've got a bunch of ground to cover today because in the last episode, we had something that should have only taken a few hours and it took all day. This filming process is a cumbersome one. But for a guy like me that really wants to, power forward and make good forward progress on stuff like this, it's driving me nuts. So we're gonna see how much we can get done today, and it's quite a long list that I'd like to accomplish. I spent some time thinking last night, and I've decided we are going to start with cutting some more chassis out of this car. I want to remove the upper control arms and cut off the front upper control arm mount because it interferes with where I'd like the engine to ultimately be. I want to move the engine back, give or take 1 more inch. And if I don't do that, I think I'm going to have axle reliability issues in the future. I think we're going to be blowing up CV joints, and I don't want to deal with that. I'd rather make some changes to the control arms and the control arm pickup points, so we don't have to deal with that. So that's where we're going. We got to cut out a control arm mount and the brace that attaches to it. We've got to remove some control arms. We've got to pull an oil pan off of the engine because we are going dry sump, and we've got some dry sump pan dimensions now. And we've got to put that engine back in this car so that we can actually start making some mounts. So let's see how far along we get today. I'm diving right into this one by removing the rear upper control arms. This process, thankfully, was as easy as pretty much everything else has been on this car. None of the hardware was seized and everything came right apart. The construction of it was pretty simple, and although previously I complained that I thought these control arms would be really heavy, I was pretty surprised. They're actually kind of lightweight. I don't know how much lighter I can really make them once we build some new ones. The driver's side of the car came apart just as easily, and within a handful of minutes, I had the entire thing taken apart. I hopped into the engine bay, and once again we're seeing the reciprocating saw action in more or less real time. I thought this was kind of fun to see and didn't want to shortchange this process by fast forwarding. I'm cutting out the diagonal braces first, which is going to give me access to cutting off the control arm mount that we need to get rid of. Cutting through the mount itself was a bit more time consuming because I not only had to cut through the steel of the horizontal frame member, but the thick steel of the bracket and tab itself. It took some muscle to get this saw through the bracket, but this too cut off pretty easily. I jumped over to the other side to repeat the process. I'm not too worried about anything moving without these diagonal braces because the chassis is relatively stiff and there's no load on these members. Nothing really pinched the saw while I was working on it either, which means nothing really moved. Once again though, we will add a lot of support back in once we're done with this process and add new control arm mounts in. So we've got those cut off. It's not the best cut, not the straightest, but it doesn't matter. We're gonna do some cleanup on these once we actually figure out what I'm gonna do for a front control arm mount, figure out exactly where I wanna mount it and where I want it located, how I wanna design it. So we're just gonna leave the ends of these cut off. I'll probably clean up some of the chopped off diagonal brace just so that I don't scrape myself on it. But while I'm in here, I'm gonna get a little bit sidetracked. I'm gonna go in and pull this panel out. It's riveted into place. I know there's some sound deadening behind it, so we'll get rid of some of that. And the reason for this is there's a tab that I wanna get rid of, and this is blocking it. I wanna cut it off. So let's pull this thing out, and then we'll get back to some metal finishing. In a previous episode, I showed the process of drilling out rivets if you've never done that before. It's pretty easy though. Once I pulled this panel out of the way, there was a brief moment where I thought this white insulation could be asbestos, but a quick Google search revealed that it's a material called rock wool. That was a big weight lifted off my shoulders, and I got to removing it. I hopped out of the car and went on to the trunk to start disassembling it. I had left the carpet in previously, so that meant pulling it out. It was still glued down to all of the paneling and insulation inside. Clearly there's a lot of insulation in the trunk because the muffler was originally located below this. I think all of this was meant to keep the heat out from melting things like your groceries or anything you might have in your luggage. I had to pull the antenna and a handful of other wires as part of getting the carpet out and giving myself the ability to get to some more rivets. There were a lot hiding, and it was pretty tricky to get all of these. It would be quite interesting to do this if you had never done it before and wanted to preserve this to replace it after working on the car. It was a bit of a scavenger hunt to find some of the rivets which are buried underneath the glued down insulation. There was a ton of rock wool under this panel, and it was stuffed into every nook and cranny. I read online that this is where a lot of 308 owners find hiding rust, which makes a lot of sense because moisture could really easily get trapped in here, but I was pretty fortunate and didn't find any hiding. I knew I was getting sidetracked, but I guess I got completely carried away. This has turned into a much bigger project than I anticipated. Turns out it was definitely necessary to pull this stuff out of the trunk. Without that, I wouldn't be able to get to these rear bumper shocks, which I wanted to get out. I think those are about 7 pounds a piece, give or take. And it turns out everything else that I pulled out is pretty heavy too. In loose insulation alone, we're at like 6 pounds of weight. And between the aluminum paneling, the fiberglass, and the heavy jute with the aluminum backing, we might be looking at like 20 pounds that we pulled out of the trunk of this thing, which I'm pretty pumped on because I thought we were pretty much done losing weight on this thing. So to find that kind of a chunk of weight and have it come out that easy is pretty awesome. Before I jump back into the engine bay, I am gonna do a little bit of cleanup back here, just kind of knock some of the loose stuff off and vacuum it up just because I don't wanna have to look at this, but then we need to get back on track. I used those 3M bristle discs on this just like I did for the interior, and it made really quick work of everything. This was a total breeze to remove this stuff, although I wasn't hugely thorough. I just wanted to clean it up a bit so I didn't have to look at the mess. I then got out the shop vac and cleaned everything up, and thankfully it looked a lot better. I then grabbed the flap wheel and hopped back into the engine bay to clean up some of the cut-off material I mentioned before. I only recorded one side because I figured this really isn't all that interesting to see, and we did this for pretty much most of the last episode. I finished it up with the die grinder and a sanding disc. Once I hopped out of the car, I realized just how big of a mess I had made, so I needed to take a minute to clean it all up and do some sweeping. The big mess was really starting to stress me out and making it hard to feel like I was getting anything productive done, even if that was the case. All right, that feels a lot better. Now let's get the pan pulled off of the K24 and lower this engine back down in the engine bay. We can finally see where it's gonna sit with those control arm mounts gone, and we can come up with a new game plan. Removing the oil pan was really easy as it was just held on by 2 bolts as a placeholder previously. With the oil pan off, it was time to put the engine back into the car. I was a bit nervous to try doing this by myself, but thankfully it went really smoothly, and as far as installing engines and transmissions go, it is probably pretty hard to make anything much easier than this. It clears everything with tons of room and didn't snag on anything at all going in. I'm glad that this engine bay originally housed a V8 because I've got a lot of room to play with. All right, so I just set the motor down, and I am super stoked on the change that provided. This thing looks so much better than it ever did before. And I know what we had before was just setting it down in there for the first time and seeing where it lands. And what we have right now isn't ultimately a whole lot different. It's balancing on a handful of different things, but we're just trying to inch our way closer and closer to that final engine position so we can actually make mounts. And man, are we getting way closer. Check this out. So I know just looking in here, there's a lot to digest and a lot to unpack, and I'm gonna do my best to explain kind of what we've accomplished. So here is our remaining tab from the control arm. And previously we had about this much more chassis here. So the engine was about this much further forward before it made contact. And I have a little piece of metal clamped into place just to gap this off of the chassis a little bit. Not really important why right now, but overall you can see we've moved the entire engine back by the amount that we cut out. And the result is, in here we're looking at our intermediate shaft from the transmission, so the axle is going to attach to this. And now we are much closer to being in line with the stub shaft. It's a little off. We're probably going to remove a little bit more off of this. Probably bring it into here, give or take. Get this engine moved back just a touch more. but we're really close if you can kind of visualize center line to center line. It's so much closer than it was before. We're looking so much better. Here I've got a piece of aluminum that is milled down to pretty much the height of our oil pan, and this isn't the best setup here, I know that, but this is essentially how high off of the frame we need the block to be. This is pretending to be our oil pan height, and that tells us where the engine needs to be. And if you guys remember, the height of this, the output shaft, was considerably higher before. It just barely cleared underneath this horizontal member. So if we look at the other side, you can probably see some of it a little bit better, but I wanted to start over here because this is the side I've been paying more attention to. So here we are on this side, and if you go back and look at some of the old videos, or maybe I'll throw a clip in here, you'll get an idea of where our output used to be. Right now we're pretty much centered in the chassis, and previously it was several inches higher. It was probably 2 inches higher up. So we've gained a ton of room for clearance. We don't have a tube right here in the way anymore, and we're almost directly in line with the stub axle. It's really close. We don't have to have it perfect, but the closer to in line, the better. And so same on this side. You can see we had about, 2.5 inches of chassis here before, 2 inches of chassis. It's now gone. The engine is just about up against this chassis member. And you can get an idea of what we've gained. On this side as well, we're gonna remove some more, probably take it back another inch, so that we can just bring the output from the transmission on each side just a smidge further back and get it perfectly in line with our stub axles. So we've improved a lot on height, we've improved a lot on fore and aft positioning, and you can see up here, the engine height is now actually underneath the top of the engine bay. So the engine cover sits on top of this, and we are completely below that. We now have an engine that fits in the engine bay, and overall, this is a huge gain. We're really starting to get somewhere with this. And obviously we've got lots of room in front of the engine, lots of room behind. We're probably gonna remove this. We're looking really good overall, guys. Got lots of room to play with. I'm quite happy. So I think next on the list, probably tomorrow, is I'm gonna cut a little bit more off of those chassis members that we just modified today, so that we can get just a touch more movement of the engine backwards. Now, if you're worrying about the changes to the suspension, don't. We'll dive into why it doesn't matter in a future episode, but the simple answer is we're moving a pickup point fore and aft on the same plane that it was before. It's not going to affect our suspension geometry at all. We're just giving ourselves more room, and it means we've got to change the upper control arm to now fit with the car. Overall, I'm really happy with how today's gone. I've been itching to actually get some stuff done, and the engine's sitting back in the car. We're on our way towards making this thing actually fit, towards making engine mounts. We've got lots of chassis cut out of the car. We removed, not including the chassis stuff, 30 pounds of material today, and that doesn't include those bumper shocks, so we're gonna near 40 more pounds. Really happy with that, wasn't expecting that today. Overall, I'm stoked, and I'm eager for this weekend because I plan on coming back in. I don't have anything else going on. I wanna thrash on this thing, see if we can't, for the next episode on Tuesday, make a serious step forward. Maybe we'll have a long episode, fingers crossed. As always, I want to thank you guys for supporting me, for watching this channel, for liking, subscribing, and commenting. That stuff does a ton for me as a content creator, and I'm appreciative of all of it, so thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm excited for next week. I'm going to catch you guys in the next episode. Thanks as always. Also, I've had a number of you guys comment and ask about the chassis pieces that have come off this car, and have mentioned something like providing these to Patreon supporters or something like that, and I've never really considered doing anything like that. But if it's something that you guys would like to see, I'm certainly open to it. I'd love to find more ways to interact with you guys and provide more content. So if you'd like to see a Patreon happen and you'd like access to things like parts that come off the car, or perhaps some of the old StanceWorks apparel that I have, let me know and maybe I can set something up. Thanks again for the support.